What can I do as a black person in this country that isn't threatening? My black body, my whole essence, my whole being has been weaponized by the police in this country.
It's all too familiar in the United States. A black person killed by the police, protests, calls for justice, and the cycle repeats.
So they're pepper spraying us? Outside the White House?
By some estimates, 2020 has seen the largest protest movement in U.S. history, all centered on the killing of black people by police.
911, where's the emergency? Somebody kicked in the door and shot my girlfriend.
In March, Breonna Taylor shot in her own home.
What do you want? I can breathe.
And then in May, George Floyd in Minneapolis, where more than 8 minutes were caught on cell phone of an officer kneeling on his neck despite his pleas.
Mama.
Get up and get in the car.
The day after that, protests erupted in Minneapolis, and they've spread across the country. There have been protests in all 50 states.
Millions of people across the U.S. took to the streets in the middle of a pandemic that had largely shut down the country. But what was at the center of all this were too many cases that had gone unseen and unheard.
My name is Marqueese Alston. My son is Marqueese Alston. Marqueese was killed by DC police on June 12, 2018.
It's names like Marqueese Alston that you may have never heard, as well as the ones that are better known. Michael Brown, Sandra Bland, Eric Garner, that have pushed the U.S. to this moment.
People are dying right now. Children are being shot right now.
Black people should not be defending their very existence. It is 2020.
Everything I do, my breathing is violent to them. We can't even sleep in our own home. We can't even play video games at 1 o'clock in the morning with our nephews. I can't even play music in the car at the gas station. How many black people?
It's also years of promises of reform and change that came without justice.
Reforms is just not going to work, and so we're not here for that conversation anymore. We have to remove this institution that was built on systematic racism and built on the backs of killing black and brown individuals.
What do we want? Justice! What do we want now?
When we met Marqueese Alston in July, it had been just over 2 years since her son, 22-year-old Marqueese, was shot and killed by police in Washington, D.C.
How did you find out about what happened?
I was headed to dinner and I got a call from one of Marqueese's friends, and as soon as I answered, I heard the panting in the phone. And so I said, "What's wrong?" And she said, "Marqueese has been shot." And I said, "Okay, what hospital are we going to?" Because of course, I thought positive. And she said, "We're not going to the hospital, he's gone." I got home, and of course, on the 10 o'clock news, it was there.
Police have been on scene here for hours. They tell us the shooting happened just after 7 o'clock. Investigators say a group of guys were out in that alley. When officers approached them, that's when shots were fired.
I had not been notified. I didn't sleep that night because I was just waiting for them to come. And they didn't get there until about 2 o'clock p.m. the next day.
What has it been like for you to get answers about what happened that night?
It's been agonizing, traumatizing, disheartening, dreadful. I've just been trying to get simple questions answered. What initially took place to cause this to happen?
Now, I want to show you where it happened.
The D.C. Police Department said that officers were on patrol when they approached Marqueese, though initially it was unclear why.
When officers entered the back alley, there was a group of adult males there. One of the adult males produced a weapon. There were shots fired.
But witnesses at the scene disputed the police account.
From what I heard out my window, it was no exchange of gunfire. It was just straight up. Brrr.
Marqueese was shot multiple times.
The autopsy report, the gunshot wounds, it stated if the gunshot wounds were repetitive, that they would not individually list them. So I can't even count the total of gunshot wounds that he suffered from. This is crazy.
Marqueese was one of the 13 people killed by DC police since 2015, 12 of whom were Black. Since her son was killed, Kenethia has tried to find out what happened that night.
As of today, MPD has not provided me with any sufficient facts of this case.
She's testified before the city council, submitted public records requests, and filed a civil lawsuit against the city. But it's been nearly impossible to get answers from them.
What I would wish the city would give me is to treat me as I am a Black life that matters, a human being that matters, if that makes sense. The truth, accountability, transparency. That's what I desire from the city.
As she's fought for answers, Kenethia has also had to relive her loss when another Black person is killed by police in the U.S.
Each time I hear a life lost due to the police, it brings forth so much anxiety, so much pain. It hurts. It hurts. And I say, here we go again. Here we go again.
Please. Please. Please, I can't breathe. Please, man. Please.
It was the horrific killing of George Floyd on May 25th, captured on cell phone by a bystander, where he repeatedly told the police he couldn't breathe, that sparked the protests that swept the U.S.
The crowds are bigger than I've seen them yet. Everyone is yelling, "We won't leave."
The question now is, will this moment be different?
People are tired. You have to realize that we have a whole generation of people who that entire time just heard almost every week another Black person killed, another hashtag. I can't imagine what that does to the psyche to grow up where over half your life is just another Black body killed in the street, another Black body slain, another Black person killed by choking, by saying, I can't breathe. Like
Tracy Redd is one of the thousands of people that took to the streets in DC in the protests after George Floyd was killed the last week of May. Deployed with shields and tear gas as the protests grew, police were more aggressive each day.
Saw someone eye bust open, bleeding. Someone had welts all over their body, got tear gas, pepper spray, and after their eyes were flushed out, they went right back out to the front. And that energy to me was just so raw and so organic.
I am your president of law and order and an ally of all peaceful protesters.
On June 1st, 1 week after the killing of George Floyd and just after the president delivered these remarks, police began to clear protesters from in front of the White House. The police did this for President Trump, who wanted to take a photo at the church across from the White House. After the violent clearing of the park that day, the president flooded the streets of D.C. with scores of federal forces.
Without police.
But 2 weeks later, and as the protests continued, the president took a slightly different approach.
Today I'm signing an executive order encouraging police departments nationwide to adopt the highest professional standards to serve their communities. These standards will be as high and as strong as there is on earth.
The executive order called for the creation of a nationwide database to track excessive use of force by police officers and for police departments to adopt better practices. But it was unclear what tangible effect the order would really have. Even then, it was still a change in how Trump has approached policing since he took office, by moving away from police reform efforts of the Obama administration. Those reforms were sparked during another reckoning on police violence in the U.S. in the wake of the killing of 18-year-old Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014.
Sit down for Michael Brown. We are from here.
It sort of felt like people who were used to being bullied for many years suddenly started to stand up for themselves.
Justin Hansford lived 10 minutes from Ferguson at the time, working as a law professor.
People were excited, people were happy.
He was a legal observer and one of thousands of people who took to the streets then, even in the face of a heavy militarized response from the police.
Hands up.
Ferguson was the spark. I think we've had a long history of responding to police violence.
Come on, keep laughing. It's funny, right? Only cowards use guns.
But Ferguson was the first time where people didn't just take to the streets and protest, but they actually had to bring out tanks because they saw that people were going to take it to the next level.
Justice! What do we want? Now! What do we want? Justice! What do we want? Now!
It was in the aftermath of this that the Department of Justice, under the Obama administration, began to ramp up efforts to reform policing in the United States. One part of that was increasing investigations into police departments, including Ferguson's.
This was about the death of Michael Brown, but not only about the death of Michael Brown.
Jonathan Smith was on the Justice Department's team that conducted a civil rights investigation into the Ferguson Police Department.
So we went into Ferguson to try to understand what was happening in that community, the operation of its police department, the effect of that police department on the community, and whether the police department was engaging in patterns of violations of the Constitution.
Among the findings of their investigation was that the Ferguson Police Department disproportionately used force against the Black community.
Why everybody look like me gotta be a criminal? There's no honor in that badge.
I get harassed on the daily, and it's harassment that go on every day for people, including myself, including a lot of these black males.
Brake lights are $100. Driving while suspended is $200.
And that the police, along with local officials, systematically targeted Black residents with tickets and fines as a way to make money for the city.
African Americans were targeted by the police department and brought into the court system, and that their pockets would be continued to be drained sort of almost in perpetuity.
Were you surprised by any of your findings in Ferguson?
I wasn't. I mean, by the time that we investigated the Ferguson Police Department, that was in the last administration, that was about the 20th, I think it was the 20th investigation that we had conducted of police departments across the country. And
investigations like this were one of the central components of the Obama administration's police reform efforts.
We knew that we looked across the country that there was a serious and deep problem, and at core, almost of all of them was a failure of police departments to be accountable internally so that officers who engaged in misconduct were held to account, and that departments themselves were held accountable to their communities.
No respect, no accountability. Who do you protect? Who do you serve? Who do you protect? Who do you protect? Who do you serve? Who do you protect? Who do you serve?
The Ferguson report did do a lot to help people to really come to grips with what the protesters were saying from day one. We had been telling people that there was racial profiling, but they didn't believe it until they saw the DOJ report.
But the Obama administration's police reform efforts went beyond investigations. Funding and grants were issued for initiatives like body cameras to increase transparency.
Last year, the events in Ferguson.
And a task force convened, making a number of recommendations to improve policing in the U.S., specifically by focusing on community relations and having police officers undergo training for bias.
You guys are on another okay.
But now, 6 years after Ferguson, the country faces yet another reckoning. In Minneapolis, where George Floyd was killed, There have been calls for the Trump administration to investigate the police department, but they have yet to do so.
Bro, you just killed that man, bro.
Reacting to this incident by immediately putting the department under investigation doesn't necessarily result in improving the situation. But
this was consistent with the Attorney General's previous public comments, saying that the problem is only a few rogue officers and that there's no systemic racism in policing.
He's stopping his breathing.
The Trump administration has largely stopped federal investigations into police departments.
The more fundamental problem is in the structure of policing and the culture of policing. I mean, what happened to George Floyd is a very good example of that. You had not one officer engage in misconduct, but you had officers that were bystanders that didn't intervene to prevent that from happening.
Minneapolis raises another question, though. Does reform work? More than a year before George Floyd was killed, the city had put all of its police officers through trainings on implicit bias. And nationally, police killings did not go down in the years after Ferguson and the Obama-era reform efforts.
What we see 5 or 6 years later, we have cities like Washington, D.C., the city where we're in, where there are plenty of body cameras, where you've got all these different rules and regulations in place. But these are all things that can be manipulated and evaded.
Body cameras were a key part of both local and federal reform, with the goal of increasing transparency. But even that has come with challenges for families.
For you in your son's case, what has it been like trying to get access to that body cam footage?
I thought it would be as simple as what they initially told me to do. We submitted that request only for them to respond back to say Marqueese needed to submit the request since he was involved in the body cam. And so my attorney then responded and said he's deceased. He's not able to make the request, so that's why his mother is making the request.
She was finally able to see some of the footage in August of last year, but not all of it. And even then, she says it was heavily edited.
The 5 minutes included a narration of what they depicted happened, which included some PowerPoints. It was a package, edited version, the 5 minutes of what we saw.
Hi, good morning. This message is for Miss Marqueese Alston.
4 days after we interviewed her, Marqueese received a voicemail from D.C. Police.
D.C. Police Department will be releasing the body camera footage of the shooting involving Marqueese Alston. We just wanted to contact you, reach out to you in advance and let you know it will be released today.
The footage was released publicly before Marqueese could see it. In the footage, police began the interaction with Marqueese by jumping out of their car and running after him. Because the audio was not turned on until later, we don't know why they went after him.
Shots fired. Check over here. The gun's on the ground somewhere. I don't know. No, he shot at
They
you.
claim they saw the outline of a gun in his pocket and that Marqueese shot first before the officers repeatedly shot him. The Metropolitan Police Department declined our request for an interview. In a statement, Ms. Alston's lawyer said the footage does not show Marqueese fired a gun or that the object in his hand was one.
Did the gun get shot?
And that without the full audio, key details are still missing.
The magazine's not in it anymore. Hey, everything's good.
Police made the video public along with footage from the deaths of 2 other Black men, but they were only released because of a new city legislation that requires them to release body camera footage in fatal shootings.
I'm still on right now.
It was passed in June in response to the latest wave of protests. But people on the street weren't calling for more reform or legislation.
Nobody was holding up signs saying more body cameras for police, more money for police training, right? That's how they got out of the last crisis, was with more money and more resources, body cameras and the training and all that. But none of these directly address the sort of scope of policing and the substantive outcomes of policing.
The lack of success of reforms has turned the national conversation to one local activists have been advocating for years: defunding police departments on the path to eliminating them completely. Abolition. They want to cut police budgets and the number of officers patrolling and often surveilling their communities and redirect that money to healthcare, education, and housing.
We've been funneling a lot of money into police reforms, and it's not actually keeping anyone any more safe. I have no faith in an institution that needs to be reminded not to choke me.
We met with a group of DC organizers in one of the most policed areas of the city.
What has happened over the years is that the police have become the place where people call for everything, right?
We are creating work for police that not only does the police not need to do, like nobody needs to do that work. Nobody needs to be out there criminalizing people experiencing homelessness. They need homes. Nobody needs to be criminalizing people who are experiencing drug addiction. They need health care.
What would abolishing the police mean and look like?
To me, that looks like knowing where I can get food and water. That looks like having safe housing all the time. That looks like being able to stand outside and not be worried about being literally surveilled and terrorized for existing while black.
In basically any other ward, you have multiple choices. And over here we don't. We actually have no place to give birth. There's no OBGYN ward at all over here east of the river. And that's the type of thing that like literally doesn't keep you safe. Like when I think about even, thinking about getting pregnant, I'm like, wow, that's dangerous over here as a black woman.
When I have a 13-year-old to tell me that he took that lady's purse because his mother had no food in the house to feed his children. You give them the resources in that community where that little boy don't feel like he needs to be stealing a purse. He can be at a recreation center, which we lack.
DC's mayor has said that cutting the police budget will make the city less safe, but that doesn't feel true for some residents.
We just had an 11-year-old murdered, killed at a 4th of July cookout. It was a policeman in that area, and he still got shot. And therefore, you can't tell me that the police could have kept that little guy safe. Reform don't work. Dismantling is what works, and investing in black communities and resources that keep us safe.
Brothers and sisters, we are at a moment of reckoning in America.
As the summer came to an end and as protests continued, yet another black person was shot by police.
Just within these past several days, we have seen the attempted murder of Jacob Blake in Wisconsin.
Jacob Blake was shot 7 times in the back at point-blank range. It happened just 5 days before thousands of people gathered in the U.S. Capitol to mark the anniversary of the historic March on Washington in 1963, and as they continued to demand justice and change. Kenithia came too, with her granddaughter, Marqueese's daughter, Lyric. She was also one of many family members who spoke about their loved ones killed by police.
Call this number right here on this Google printout, and you can find out where your son is. Unfortunately, that has been the only formal communication the Metropolitan Police Department has shared with me in regards to my son. As a traumatized, grieving mother, know this: I demand truth and transparency for Marqueese's daughter.
This society still doesn't understand what it is to not continuously kill us as a people because the color of our skin is hurtful, and it just re-traumatizes each time.
I wish George were here to see this right now. That's who I'm marching for. I'm marching for George, for Breonna, for Ahmaud, for Jacob, for Pamela Turner, for Michael Brown, TRAYVON, and anybody else who lost their lives.
There is a strength in us coming together as mothers who've lost our sons due to police brutality. And it's to reaffirm in me that I'm not by myself in this walk, in this journey.
In spite of what we go through, be strong, stand tall, be encouraged. Don't stop saying Black Lives Matter. Don't stop peaceful protesting. Don't stop praying.
Don't stop uniting. Stand together. This is what this is about. We was built for this.
Today is a recharge for more to come, and me advocating for Marqueese's truth. What keeps me going is Marqueese's 4-year-old daughter. She's very curious, and so I want to be able to provide her truth as to why her father was killed by the Metropolitan Police Department.
It's